Okay, so in this lecture, I want to carry on the topic of early childhood, 3 to 6, and I want to talk about some of the different models, if you will, for early childhood education. In your textbook, there's just a brief discussion about different models. One is called the Montessori approach, and then the other is called I never can say that, the Rigo Emilia approach. I'm not that familiar with the Amelia approach. I will tell you that both of them are kind of similar in that they don't really have like a formal, there's not a, at this time we do sensory table and at this time we do, paper crafts, but rather what they have in common is they're more child-led. So what the child is offered a variety of developmentally appropriate activities, and then the child just initiates their interaction. What the Montessori approach has that the Amelia one doesn't, as I understand it, is that there's a little bit more direction. The Amelia approach is one that, as I understand it, where the child sort of takes the lead, and then it would be as if the caregiver is just there to sort of answer questions, where the Montessori would be one where the caregiver provides or offers some guidance, like maybe let's all go over to this activity, and then as opposed to the other one that's just a little bit more child-led, a little bit less structured. And I know there's a Montessori school here in Salina. Compensatory, now your textbook does go into a brief discussion about what is meant by compensatory, and this is this compensatory program was intended or is designed to acknowledge or to recognize, to identify, that's the word I'm looking for, is that when children are identified to be at risk for early childhood developmental delays, as meaning that they're not ready, or it's anticipated, or that they're not going to be ready for school age, they're not going to be ready for kindergarten, or they're going to be significantly behind their peers, that they provide free public early childhood pre-K. So the best well-known program that I'm sure we've all heard of is Head Start, and Head Start is considered one of these compensatory programs, right? And so the cool thing about Head Start is that is designed. Now, I don't have any experience knowing that if it actually meets these designs. I mean, I have a little bit of knowledge as to how they work, but the design is that it's a holistic approach. So Head Start programs are not just for the child, but they're also for the family, and they have social workers that help the families connect with resources. So in that sense, that it's not just about reading, writing, it's not just about those basic sort of thing, the academics of early childhood, if you will. And it did begin in the 1960s under President Johnson's War on Poverty, and routinely, continuously, early childhood education struggles with getting funding, even though the research is abundantly clear that children who have access to quality early childhood education will be more successful in school. What is not clear is how long that effect is, but teachers are well aware of when children come to them and having been, because part of what early childhood is, and used to be all that kindergarten was. I mean, kindergarten has increasingly become more academic, but once upon a time, kindergarten was just about, teaching children the structure of what a school day was going to be, right? Teaching them to sit still in their chairs and to listen to bells and things like that. But because partly because more people have gotten access to early childhood, kindergarten is increasingly becoming more accurate, more academic. And this bothers some people, not all people, but it bothers some, and they argue that, kindergarten is not supposed to be about academics. But here's the sociologist in me, is that if your child is not at the same place as their peers, they will struggle socially, they will struggle academically, and probably emotionally. So we might not like the fact that our child is learning, math, basic math in kindergarten, but if you're in a community where every child in kindergarten is learning basic math, you want your child to be, you don't need to want, but I mean, your child will be more successful if they are at the same place academically and socially as their peers. it's just basic social deviance theory that when you're not the same place that everybody else is. But what your textbooks do suggest is that the function of kindergarten has traditionally been to prepare children emotionally and socially for the structure, like how it's going to run. And then there has been some debate and some research that's looked at the variable of full day kindergarten versus half day kindergarten. And according to your textbook, full day kindergarten is becoming more common. I know that I went to full day daycare, I went to full day kindergarten, but I also grew up in a very poor and a very rural community. And your textbook suggests that that's more common in rural communities, partly because of the distance that families may have to come to get to school, but it also because of the cost, right? Because a kindergarten is going to be less expensive than daycare. I mean, I can still remember being thrilled when my kid was finally in school all day because I could save a fortune on daycare. So it's less expensive and it makes it easier for parents to work. Even though if your school gets out at 3 o'clock, you still got to figure out what you're going to do between 3 and 5 o'clock, right? Okay, so now we're going to switch topics for the next couple minutes that we have in this particular video lecture to the topic of psychosocial. So this is the discussion about your personality development and emotional development. So this is where we really, more of the emotional stuff. In this chapter, there is a discussion about what's referred to as self or the self concept. Right, so that may sound like a really abstract idea, as it sometimes does to me, but the self, when we talk about self, what we really mean is the understanding, the comprehension that I am different than you, right? So the self-concept, your textbook uses language like, oh, that's right, so what am I, Samuel? I'm on page 232. The self-concept is defined as, fiddlesticks, a cognitive construction of who we are. What the dickens does that mean, right? What the dickens does it mean to have a cognitive construction of who we are, right? But so it breaks it down a little bit to help us, to help sort of take that part of that apart. Well, what we mean, what exactly is meant by the self. Well, one concept is what is referred to as a single representation. So your textbook uses an example of a child who has a single representation. He would say something like, he would only see himself in like one dimension. So I am strong, or I like pizza. And he hasn't yet grasped the idea that he can be both, that he can both be strong and like pizza. He's either one or. Right? That his sense of self is quite simplistic in that sense, that he's a one-dimensional thing. Then there's this idea of what's referred to as real self versus ideal self. And it says the ideal self is, so children have a cognitive tendency to overestimate their abilities, right? So they can fly or they can jump to the moon. That would be their ideal self. And this is something that a lot of adults don't do very well at, is grasping who they really are. I was recently listening to a podcast that says that like 85% of people will rate themselves above average. Well, if you know anything about averages, not everybody can be above average, right? I mean, half of us have to be below average. And that would be an example of your ideal self versus who you really are. And just as sort of a side note, people who have a good sense of their real self actually have better well-being, right? Too inflated sense of self, you come up with narcissism. But anyway, so we start to see some of this contrast in this developmental stage. And then there's what is he referred to as representative mapping, and it says, that one aspect of himself, it says, I can run fast and I can climb. So this is sort of a logical idea. It's the idea that a child is able to draw conclusions about who they are based on some of their observations about themselves. So in this case, the child knows that they can run fast, and they know that they can climb trees, and so they then have a representative sort of an overall understanding of themselves, and therefore they must be strong, if that makes any sense. Just for the record, I'm not going to quiz you on any of these specific concepts, other than to understand these things. You remember in the last activity, right, in the last chapter, where there was the video about the rouge test and the children who touched their forehead. The question was, what did it mean when a child touched their forehead, that dot on their forehead? Well, it meant that they knew that was that was themselves in the mirror. That's part of this idea of the sense of self. But self, in this early stages, we get to who is the self? Who are you? And part of understanding who we are is what we call your self-esteem. I also listened to a great podcast on self-esteem the other day, and he basically said that the majority, like 99% of people have a high sense of self, a high regard for themselves, right? They have a high self-esteem, but self-esteem implies that you understand. You have to have a cultural sense of social expectations, but you understand who your relative worth compared to other people, right? And what does it say? It says, oh, so there's different ways of thinking about one's self-esteem. And this is really a pretty fascinating topic. And again, I'm not doing it justice here, but what is discussed in your textbook is the idea of a contingent self-esteem, as opposed to, oh, I forgot what the other one is, what the opposite of contingent, but oh, it's come on, it's right there on the tip of my tongue. But a contingent self-esteem is when my worth is defined by how successful I am, as unconditional positive regard. That's right. As opposed to an unconditional sense of self, is that my self-esteem is not is my, just because I exist, right? An unconditional acceptance of myself, as opposed to a contingent self-esteem, or a conditional, which means my worth, I only have worth when I'm successful, when I bring home good grades. Okay. Oof, yeah. But anyway, so self-esteem is now this great podcast I was talking about. He talks about how self-esteem is what he calls a sociometric, and that the reason, and that our self-esteem goes up and down over the course of like events. And when we're feeling that, it's really a measure of how, if we're feeling accepted or rejected. So when someone dumps us, for instance, that, oh man, my self-esteem is sort of diminished because we've effectively experienced a sense of rejection. But overall, and he argues that this is a very ancient and a very evolutionary state of being, because in a hunting and gathering and ancient kind of peoples, if you were not part of a group, then you basically died. That you had to be part of a group in order to survive. And so we developed this sense of what we call self-esteem, to measure or to gauge if we're being accepted or rejected. The last idea here, and I'm just going to have to kind of carry on, go over my self-imposed 10 minutes, comes from Erickson. And you remember Erickson is the fella that talked about like trust, and how we move through these different stages of the developmental life course, and we had virtues, we had these crises that we had to manage. And the one that's going on between in early childhood is what he called initiative versus guilt. And the crises, right, the struggle that we're dealing with is something he called, like I said, I'm still looking at my slide over here, is something that he called the desire to do. So the 3-year-old, me do, I got it, I want to do it by myself, let me, right? And you can see that in small kids, versus the desire to be for adult approval. So children are really struggling, and he calls this initiative, me do, and the guilt of I did bad, right? So how a child reconciles these two tensions between, I want to do it by myself, I want to be independent, right? I mean, I can just see my own children. I can feel myself doing this to my dad, because my dad would always try to like take everything over and like, I want to do it myself, right? This initiative versus the guilt. What happens if I mess up? Oh, if I make a mistake, if I make a mess, my parents are going to be mad at me. Or if I fail, or, you know, they'll love me if I do a pretty picture, but what if I don't do a pretty picture? So how do they reconcile both of these things? Because if you get too hung up on wanting approval, you may not even try. And that's actually what we call learned helplessness, right? You may not even try because you'll be so inhibited by the fear of failure or the fear of making a mistake. But at the same time, you want to try everything. And how else does a person learn about the world and about how to do things if they don't try? So you've got this constant battle. And he argued, he said the virtue, the outcome of reconciling this tension between the two is what he called purpose. And so purpose, as I have summarized it, is the courage to try new things without too much inhibition. So a child who successfully reconciles this tension between guilt, or between initiative, I want to do it, and guilt, oh, I'm going to mess up, is a child who can try new things without feeling too afraid that they're going to mess up, right? Because you don't want a kid to be like too afraid they're going to mess up and don't try anything, but you also don't want a kid who's going to try anything without any consequences, right? Without thinking through any of the consequences. How many times do your parents say, "What were you thinking?" Right? So anyway, so that is, and this purpose that children come out of the stage with, and is what, anyway, that's sort of Erickson's model. And I'm finally going to stop here. In the next one, I want to talk about gender. That's a topic that I could talk about all semester. Okay, but I'll stop here.